Welcome to 21st Sports Recap and Reaction for the St. Louis Rams at the Seattle Seahawks in their Week 16 matchup played December 27, 2015. We're going to go over every possession, the stats, and give our breakdown and analysis of this NFC West Division rivalry game as the Seahawks were looking to keep pace in the wild card as they did not want to lose as they're trying to secure that fifth spot. But the Rams looking to play spoiler and looking to sweep the season series as they had beat the Seahawks back in Week 1, and they were looking to beat the Seahawks in Seattle for the first time in over a decade. So starting off this game, the Rams would get the ball first and they would punt after 5 plays. The Seahawks would go 3 and out on their first possession, and then St. Louis took over at midfield after the punt and got into field goal range, and their drive would stall at the 25, and out would come Greg Zuerlein to hit a 42-yard field goal to put the first points on the scoreboard as the Rams led 3-0 with just over 8 minutes still left in the first. So now the Seahawks would get a nice return by Lockett on the kickoff that brought the ball out to the 41 to start their possession, but then a fumble. They did recover it, but that would put them back to the 35 for 2nd and 16. And after Doug Baldwin picked up 15 yards on a reception, it was 3rd and 1 from the 50, but a fumble scooped up by Akeem Ayers and returned 45 yards for the touchdown for the Rams. Zuerlein added the extra point, and it was now 10-0 St. Louis over Seattle with 6.5 left still in the first. The Seahawks would punt after 7 plays on their next possession, and now St. Louis would take over, backed up against their own end zone on their own 5-yard line, and they would get out of the shadow of their end zone and bring the first quarter to a close. But just 3 plays into the second quarter, they would end up punting the ball back to the Seahawks, who would take over at midfield on their own 46. But they ended up going backwards, and they ended up with a 3rd and 19 from the 37, and Russell Wilson was intercepted by Trumaine Johnson, and now the St. Louis Rams would take over on their own 11-yard line, but they would fail to turn the turnover into points on the board, and they would end up punting after 6 plays on the possession with about 9 minutes left before halftime. Seattle would go 3 and out on the possession that followed, and now St. Louis would take over on the Seahawks 28 after the punt, as they ended up with a 21-yard return by Tavon Austin on that punt. And so on 1st and 10 from the Seattle 28, Case Keenum dropped back, and Kenny Britt caught the pass 28 yards for the touchdown. Greg Zuerlein went for the extra point, but it was no good. And so with that missed extra point, it was 16-0 as St. Louis had jumped out to a 16-point lead with 16 straight points with just under 7 minutes left before halftime. Seattle would finally respond with a scoring drive. They started off on their own 20 after the touchback on the kickoff, and they got into St. Louis territory. They got all the way into the red zone, all the way down to the 8-yard line, but 3 incomplete passes on 1st and goal, then 2nd and goal, and 3rd and goal, brought up 4th and goal, and out came Steven Hauschka to attempt a 26-yard field goal. It was up, it was good, and it was now a 13-point game with the score St. Louis 16, Seattle 3, with less than half a minute left before halftime. The Rams would take a knee, and this game went to the half as they were up by 2 scores. So now the Seahawks would get the ball first in the second half, and they put together a pretty impressive drive going 11 plays, 67 yards in about 6.5 minutes. So they start off on their own 33, and they would end up in the red zone, and they got to the 15, but then Russell Wilson was sacked by Hayes and Sims, and so that brought up 3rd and 18 from the 25, and Russell Wilson bounced back with a 25-yard touchdown pass to Doug Baldwin. Steven Hauschka added the extra point, and it was now a 6-point game with about 8.5 minutes left in the third, with the score St. Louis 16, Seattle 10. So the Seahawks look like they were back in it, and now the Rams would get the ball, and they ate almost 5.5 minutes of game clock, a little under 5.5, but they would not score as they ended up punting after 10 plays on this possession, and that brought it to about 3 minutes left in the third, and the Seahawks would take over. They got a first down, but after 4 plays on the possession, they would end up punting from their own 27 just a minute before the end of the quarter, and now the Rams would take over on their own 38, and they brought the third quarter to a close, and they would open up the fourth quarter with a 3rd and 5 from their own 43. Case Keenum went to Cunningham. He picked up 8 yards in the first down in Seattle territory at the 49. Then on a 3rd and 1 from the 40, they ended up with a fumble, but they recovered their own fumble, and they ended up with a first down at the 35. So now they would be faced with a 2nd and 4 from the 29 and another fumble, and they would recover again. And so first Gurley had picked up 20 yards before the fumble, but it was recovered by St. Louis on the 2-yard line. So now it's 1st and goal. Then a penalty for holding would push him back to the 12, but on 2nd and goal from the 12, Gurley picks up 10 to set up 3rd and goal from the 2, and Todd Gurley scores on a 2-yard touchdown. Greg Zuerlein added the extra point, and it was now 23-10 as the Rams were back up by 13, now with 10.5 left to play in the fourth quarter. St. Louis would kick the ball to Seattle, who would then punt after 8 plays on their next possession. The Rams would also punt on their next possession as they ended up punting after 5 plays, and now the Seahawks would take over down by 2 touchdowns with the ball at midfield on the 50 with 5 minutes left to play in this game. And they got into St. Louis territory. They got down to the 28, but then a holding penalty pushed them back to the St. Louis 38. And then on 2nd and 13 from the 31, after picking up 7 yards on the previous play, Russell Wilson ended up scrambling for 21 yards, but then he ended up getting hit by Sims, and he fumbled, and Ayers recovered. He had scored a touchdown earlier, but here he secures the ball, and they ended up looking at this one. Originally, it was not ruled a fumble, but they reversed the call, and so the St. Louis Rams would get the ball with about 2.5 minutes left to play, just over 2.5 left to play, and the ball on their own 8-yard line, up by 2 scores after that fumble. So now they would end up going 3 and out on the possession, but they brought the game to the 2-minute warning and came out of the 2-minute warning and punted after 2 plays later. And so now the Seahawks would take over with just over a minute left, needing 2 touchdowns, down by 13. They had it on the St. Louis 35 after the punt, and they would end up with a 1st and 10 on the St. Louis 18 from the red zone. Russell Wilson found Jermaine Kearse for an 18-yard touchdown, but with just 17 seconds left on the clock, and Hushka hit the extra point, but it was a 6-point game with the score St. Louis 23, Seattle 17. They would go for the onside kick, but the Rams recovered. Case Keenum took a knee, and this game came to a close as the St. Louis Rams upset the Seahawks in Seattle, the first time they've won in Seattle since 2004, and they're now 7-8 on the season, 2-5 on the road. The Seahawks finish 5-3 at home. They got 1 game left to play on the road. They're now 9-6. And they go from the 5th wild card down to the 6th. They have clinched a playoff spot, but it's a matter of where are they going to go for that first round wild card game. Who's going to be the 5th seed? Who's going to be the 6th seed? Of course, they'll be watching to see what happens with Minnesota and New York in the Sunday night game. Of course, Atlanta's still alive as well, but Seattle is in. It's just a matter of if they'll be the 5th or 6th seed for that wild card spot. So they're a wild card team regardless. The loss doesn't necessarily hurt them in terms of them going to the playoffs, but it is, it does take some momentum away from them. It does kind of take some steam out of their engine. Is they had a couple of streaks broken. Is this was actually the first time in Russell Wilson's career since his first start back in 2012 where the Seahawks have not had a lead at any point in the game. Is the Rams led the entire game. Of course, they jumped out to that 16-0 lead, and they led 16-3 at the half. But the closest the Seahawks would get was 6 points when they scored the only score of the third quarter But then the Rams responded in the fourth with that touchdown to put it back to a 2-point game before that late touchdown and what basically equated to garbage time when, less than half a minute left to make it a 6-point game. I mean, technically, I guess they still could have, a miracle could have happened, and stranger things have happened in sports, but the Rams, a very impressive win. Of course, the Rams always finish strong at the end of the year, and they come away with the season sweep of the Seahawks. So many S words, it's tough not to stumble over these tongue twisters. It's the Seahawks, and the Seattle and St. Louis, and the season series swept. But a big win for the Rams. Of course, the Seahawks banged up, no beast mode. Rawls is done for the season. And so in this game, they had to rely on Russell Wilson, not much of a supporting cast around him, as he ended up being the leading rusher for the Seahawks. But Case Keenum gets his third win in a row, as he was 14 for 23 in this game. And also with Seattle, by the way, it's the first game in like 21, 25 something odd games where they didn't have a 100-yard rusher. But for Case Keenum, 14 of 23, 103 yards passing and 1 touchdown, but no interceptions. Todd Gurley had 19 carries for 85 yards and a touchdown. He also had 1 catch for 7 yards, giving him 92 total yards on the game. Kenny Britt, 3 catches for 49 yards and a touchdown. And Tavon Austin had 3 carries for 12 yards and 3 catches for 16 yards, as he ended up with 28 total yards on the game. And for Seattle, Russell Wilson, 25 for 41, 289 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception. He had 6 carries for 39 yards to be the leading rusher for the Seahawks. Doug Baldwin banged up, but he had 8 catches for 118 yards and a touchdown, as he was the leading receiver and really the only Seahawk who really had much production on this day. Of course, Jermaine Kearse did have that touchdown at the end, so he had 3 catches for 38 yards with the touchdown. And Helfett had 4 catches for 43 yards. And Fred Jackson, 5 catches for 43 yards and 2 carries for 11 yards, as he ended up with 54 total yards on the day. And Lockett, just 3 catches for 33 yards. Look at the kickers in this game. Greg Zuerlein, 1 for 1 on the field goals, 2 for 3 on the extra points. Steven Hauschka, 1 for 1 on the field goals, 2 for 2 on the extra points. And on defense, Hayes coming up huge for St. Louis. He had 3 sacks in this game. Trumaine Johnson, another interception. Ayers had a half sack, and a half sack for Sims as well. Sims also with a forced fumble, and Long had a forced fumble. Barron also had a forced fumble. But William Hayes, those 3 sacks, as he was terrorizing Russell Wilson all game long. Wright had a forced fumble for Seattle, as did Sheed. Let me look at the team stats. 18 first downs for Seattle, 14 for St. Louis. On third down, the Seahawks 8 of 17, 47% conversion rate. They went for it once on fourth down. They did convert. And for the Rams, they were 5 of 12 for 41% on third down. Total net yards, 313 for the Seahawks, 207 for St. Louis. On the ground, the Rams 104 netted, just 60 yards netted for Seattle. And through the air, the Seahawks netted 253. Russell Wilson sacked 4 times for a total loss of 36 yards. The Rams netted 103 but did not allow any sacks. Look at the penalties in this game. They really cost the Seahawks. 10 penalties for 83 yards, 5 penalties against St. Louis for 60 yards. The Rams had 2 fumbles, but they recovered both of their fumbles. The Seahawks fumbled the ball 5 times. They recovered 3 of them, but they lost 2. And we look at the red zone numbers, and the Rams were 1 for 1. They only made 1 trip, but they did convert for the touchdown to make it 100% in the red zone. In Seattle, 2 for 3, 66%. Of course, that second one came as the game was coming to a close. The time of possession, 32 minutes, 6 seconds for the Seahawks, 27 minutes, 54 seconds for the Rams. The Rams doing quite the job on defense, really shutting down what is a very good running game of Seattle. Of course, they didn't have their backs, no beast mode, no Rawls. But still, the offensive line of Seattle usually is able to get whoever's coming out of that backfield some yards, but not today. St. Louis putting the pressure on, shutting down the run, also keeping Wilson under pressure as well. And the Rams, of course, taking advantage of their opportunities to jump out to that early lead in the first half, and the Seahawks were never able to overcome that deficit. And like I said, it's the first time since back in week 1 of 2012 that the Seahawks never had a lead in the game, and that includes the postseason. So it's a big loss for Seattle. Of course, the Seahawks are in the playoffs, so regardless of the loss, I mean, it is a little bit debilitating somewhat, and really what's scary for them is the fact that not having really a back out of the, that can produce out of the backfield. Of course, Beast Mode can't get back too soon. We'll see when he is available. There are some questions as to whether he'll be able to play once it becomes January, or when exactly he could maybe make a return, as they're keeping their fingers crossed. But Russell Wilson's been having an amazing season, but just was not able to quite get them past St. Louis in this game, as the Rams defense really stepping up big time in this one, and they end up with the season series sweep over Seattle with this victory. And if the Rams can win next week, they'll end up at 500. But either way, regardless, Seattle is in the playoffs. So once they get into the playoffs, they are a dangerous team, but they're going to have to play better than they did on this day. But let me know what you think in the comments section below. Definitely interested to read your thoughts and opinions. Thank you very much for listening. It's greatly appreciated. I hope you're having a good day and having a great weekend and enjoying all the sports.